Okay, now we are recording part 2 for real. So I'm going to bring in something that I drew on paper, and you can see that on part of this image I inked it. I traced over it with a nice clear black ink, and on part of the image it's still the original pencil because I didn't like that part, so I didn't trace over it. Normally what I would do is actually bring this into Photoshop first and convert it to a true black and white, because this is just a cell phone photo and you can see that the color of the paper is not truly white, right? It's kind of yellow or orange. We're actually going to do a little experiment and see if that matters, because that's something I always do and I'm not sure if it really matters. So you can either click, it knows this is a raster that I might want to trace, so it's giving me the option here. If you don't see that, the option is here under Object. You go down to Live Trace, and I actually just go straight to this tracing options part because it's going to allow me to see what it is seeing and what is going to convert to a vector with this preview version. Now my screen is really tight because of the resolution of the projector, so it's not showing you much. But you can see I turned on preview, and if I pull this out of the way, you can see it actually did a really nice job of detecting the paper as being different from the ink, which isn't too surprising. It was high contrast. And you can see how much trouble it had with the pencil drawing over here. It found it to be really sketchy. It's all of these parts where the line is broken, those are all going to come in as individual vector objects, which is going to be a huge pain for you if you're wanting to make this one smooth line like what you see over here. So if you see it come in like this, just don't even bother. Abort mission, go back to your pencil drawing, do it over with a nice thick ink or a Sharpie, like a fine point Sharpie. Make it look really nice in the first place, then bring it in here for live trace, because this is exactly what you want to avoid, is this time-consuming maintenance that you're going to have. So this part looks pretty good, so we're just going to go ahead and trace it. You can see that there's all these thresholds that you can mess with. I've tried messing with them and they don't all make a lot of sense to me. One thing I always do is, for my purposes, because I usually am starting with line art, I turn off the fills. I don't want it to create filled polygons. I only want it to create strokes. For you, sometimes you may want it to do both, so you might turn on both. And you can set the stroke weight that it will recognize and things like that. So we're just going to see what it does with these default settings. So we hit trace. Now it's still just an object, right? How is this useful to me? So I have to go back into my live trace menu, and now you can see there's an option called expand, and so I have to hit that expand option in order for this to turn into individual vector paths that I can then alter. So now you can see all of those vertices that appeared where it determined that it needed a vertex to change the direction of that line, right? So if I zoom in here, you can see that this is one of these nice lines. If I use my direct selection tool, you'll see the handles that it created for each of these vertices to try to accommodate the curve that it was detecting. So one thing I've noticed, this is probably something that you can adjust using those settings, but I haven't figured out how yet. Often where I have, in the original drawing, I had sometimes lines coming together really close to each other. You can imagine that this used to be kind of a Y shape. And where it sees that, it actually detected it as a polygon. But since I told it not to create any filled polygons, and this is sort of the reason I told it not to, it instead created a very thin outline of a polygon. I can actually move that around so you can see that this is they're all grouped, sorry. First thing you want to do, again, I only know the short key for it, it's Command-Shift-G is ungroup, and now I can select these individual things separately from each other. So you can see that this created a little polygon that it outlined with these very thin lines, right? And I don't want those. You can see them all over the place in my image, and I really want nothing to do with those. If it was bad enough and you could see that it was going to take you a lot of time to fix those, you might go back to your original drawing, try live trace again with different settings, and see if you can minimize the occurrence of these. If you just have a few of them, there's a really easy way to get rid of them. You don't have to select them all individually. You just select one, and then you go to Select menu, Same, and then choose this stroke weight option here, and that's going to choose everything that has that same very thin look to it, right? So it ignored all of these really high stroke weights, and it selected only those really small ones. And I can zoom out and verify that it's not getting rid of anything I really want. Obviously this is a test, but I'm going to just hit delete and get rid of all of those. And you can see with this particular drawing, that leaves me with a lot of broken lines, which again is what I wanted to avoid. So if I really wanted this to, to continue this as a full drawing, I might go back to Live Trace and try that again and see if I can get more of these lines to connect as stroke rather than as detected fill. And that has to do with the maximum stroke weight that I let it choose. These areas exceeded the maximum stroke weight, so it detected them as a filled polygon instead, and that's why it drew them differently. You'll also notice that these do not all have the same stroke weight. It's trying to replicate the stroke weight of the original drawing. If that bothers you, if you want it to be all the same, you can just select everything, go to your stroke. You can see it doesn't know what to tell me the weight is because they're all different, and I can just make them all the same. Let's make them pretty fat, and now you can see that they're all the same. If I didn't like that, I can undo it. It's nice to know that all of your things are the same or different, because here if I wanted to do that select same stroke weight and I was hoping it would select all of this, you can see that it didn't select anything because this is some very specific 7.702 point stroke, right? So that's not super useful to me in certain contexts. So this one is kind of a mess. So since I want to show you Live Paint, that's sort of all I really wanted to do with Live Trace, is show you kind of how to use it. Where did it go? Does that make sense? Are there any questions about Live Trace?
What does it look like if you left the polygons in? It looks fine until you zoom in.
It looks like this. So you can see that these are appearing as empty polygons. If I had, why don't we just undo Live Trace completely, if we can. I think we can. We can try it with a different maximum stroke threshold and see what that would look like. We can also try to release Live Trace. Okay, so we released Live Trace and it went back to our original image. So we're going to go Live Trace, Tracing Options, and now I'm going to tell it strokes only, no fills, and the max stroke weight, let's say 63 points. That's probably going to be huge, right? I want to turn the preview on. You can see though that preview didn't really help me before in that particular respect. I wasn't aware that those things were going to show up as filled polygons in the preview. So some of this, again, I'm no expert, but some of it seems to just be trial and error. So now we're going to expand our Live Trace and zoom in, and it does look a little better. Some of these you can see, like that is a single traced stroke that it detected as just being really fat compared to the one that's next to it. So that's actually probably a little bit easier to fix. I'm going to ungroup everything so I can select just these two. And now I can just make those a single stroke weight. And so it's going to look a little better than it did before, but it's still not giving me exactly what my original drawing was, which was that this was a very thin point. So there's some limitations to this, and that's just to be expected. But yeah, this is a much better version of what I had drawn versus the last one with the 10-point stroke weight threshold. So yeah, I guess we can just do Live Paint in here now because that looks a lot better. So I'm going to get rid of all of this gunk over here. I'm using the direct selection tool because I wanted to only select those vertices. You can see when I delete those, it's still telling me, okay, there's vertices that were part of those same polygons or lines that you didn't delete, and then I can hit delete again if I want to get rid of those. So over here maybe I want to get rid of that whole line and then I would just select it, or maybe I only want to get rid of this part of it, so I would just delete that little part using direct selection. Okay, so let's see how this will look. This might not look great with Live Paint because there's a lot of empty spaces, but we can see what that's like. So I've selected my objects, all of them together, and I'm going to actually, what I always like to do when I'm creating a live paint object, because live paint can be a little bit finicky, at least for me, not knowing exactly how it works, is I copy and paste everything onto a new layer and have that be my live paint layer, so that if I totally mess something up, I can always go back to my original line art and that's not ruined. There's pluses and minuses to this strategy, because it is possible to change individual lines within the live paint object, as I'll show you. And in that case, your line art will no longer match your live paint. But it's also, I've found, just really nice to have that line art be separate, because in some ways it's easier to change. So what I do is I select everything, I do Command C for copy, and Command F for paste in front, which will paste it exactly where it's currently sitting, so you can't even tell that there's another thing there. I'm creating a new layer. I'm dragging that pasted in front portion to the new layer. You have to do these in a particular order, because if I now go through and try to select just that, you can see it selected everything, right? And I'm going to call this live paint layer. And I just turned off my other layer because I just don't even want to give myself the option of messing with it. Okay, so in my live paint layer, I'm going to go to live paint make. It gives you these funny vertices that tell you it's a live paint object. You can resize and everything once it's a live paint object. And now I have this tool, the paint bucket fill, which is K, and you can see it's highlighting areas that I can fill with color. So I'm going to tell it I don't care about the stroke. I don't want it to have a stroke color. I want it to have I want it to have maybe this kind of magenta color, and I can fill in that, I can fill in that, I can fill in that. Now I maybe want this part to be blue, I can fill in that. So you can see how this very quickly, even though some of these things are not actually individual polygons like what we were working with before, right? It's not like I created these circles and funky shapes that I then filled each individually. This creates those shapes for you based on the intersection of your lines. That's a huge distinction that will save you a lot of time. I could have drawn these each individually and gotten them to perfectly connect, or I can have live paint detect those connections for me, and you can actually adjust even your gap detection, so gap options. I can tell it to only stop at tiny gaps, and I can even change the definition of what a gap is. And that might, in this case, none of my gaps are tiny enough, but you can see the gap right here. If I wanted it to detect that as actually being connected, even though they're not physically connected, there's a way to get it to detect those gaps as actually connections that would separate those two fields so that you can color them differently. But anyway, so say there's another way I could do that. Say I wanted that to be different and I didn't want to have to mess with my gaps. I can go through here. I'm using my direct selection tool, and I'm just kind of randomly dragging it over these things. I want to be able to see the vertices, but if I had dragged it like that, I'm going to move the object, right? So I'm starting in a blank area, and I'm giving a random drag just so that I can see the vertices of the thing I want to change. And now I'm going to select a random one over there so that it's only paying attention to these now. And when they're empty, you can click and drag them without changing the rest of the thing, right? And that can be really useful. So here, I'm going to click and drag that until it's intersecting with this line down here. You can either do it by eye, or you can turn on the smart guides, which is Command U, probably up in there somewhere. And then it's going to tell me, oh, you're actually intersecting that path. It's highlighting the path that I've intersected. And so that's how you can tell for 100% certain that you're intersecting, or if I want it to hit exactly at a different anchor point, I can have it intersect like that. The smart guides are really handy, but they can also be kind of annoying when you're actually drawing, because they try to get things to line up for you, right? So you can see it's going to try to drag my cursor around when I'm close to intersecting because it thinks I want it to intersect. So the smart guides, I usually turn them off when I'm drawing freehand, and I turn them on when I'm doing anything else. Okay, so now because I've just adjusted something that was previously one field, it's now two fields that I can color differently. All that took was moving that little line so that it intersected the other line next to it. So live paint is super powerful.